There is a sound an old barn door makes in the dead of night when someone does not want to be heard. Not a creak, not a groan, something in between, a slow and deliberate drag of wood against wood. It's of the sound of a person holding their breath and pulling with just enough force to slip through without waking anyone on the other side. I know that sound the way I know my own heartbeat, because I heard it on the night that split my childhood in two, because I spent the years that followed making it myself, slipping out into the same darkness, carrying a secret my father had placed into my hands like something fragile and dangerous and not meant for a girl my age. I grew up old order Amish in the driftless hills of Vernon County, Wisconsin, in a settlement centered near the small town of Cashton, where the ridges roll green in every direction and the valleys hold the cold long past sunrise. My name is Keturah. I am in my early 30s now. I live in Madison. I work. I drive. I own a phone and pay my bills and do all the ordinary things that would have seemed like a foreign language in the world I came from. Our farm sat on 80 acres of rich pasture between Cashton and Westby, and we milked around 40 Holstein cows, which was a solid operation for an Amish family in a conservative district like ours. There were 7 of us children. I was the fourth, a middle child in the truest sense, quiet enough to be overlooked and watchful enough to notice everything everyone else missed. My father was a deacon. In the Amish church, the deacon sits just below the bishop and the ministers, and his particular duty, one that set him apart from every other man in our congregation, was enforcement. When someone in the community was suspected of breaking the ordnung, the deep and unwritten code of rules that governs every dimension of Amish life, it was my father who was sent to investigate, my father who reported back, my father who delivered the judgment. He was not a harsh man in the way that word usually means. He never raised his voice or his hand, but he had a stillness about him that was its own kind of severity, a way of looking at you that communicated disappointment without a single word, and in our house that look was the most powerful force in the world. My mother was his complement in every way. Where he was granite, she was warmth and motion, humming through the kitchen, singing while she pinned laundry to the line, whispering prayers over our heads at night. But she was no less committed to the rules than he was. She believed, with the kind of faith that does not bend or question, that the ordnung existed to protect us, that obedience was love made visible, and that anyone who walked away from the church after baptism had chosen the world over God, and the consequences of that choice were their own to bear. This matters because of my oldest brother, Eli. He was 11 years older than me, which meant that by the time I was old enough to truly know him, he was already straining against the edges of the life our community had set out for him. Eli was the kind of person who could not stop asking questions, not the easy kind with comfortable answers, but the kind that had no bottom. He wanted to understand how engines worked, what existed beyond the hills that surrounded our valley, why the rules were the rules and not something else entirely. In an Amish community, that kind of mind is not celebrated. Gelassenheit, the yielding of your own will to God and to the community, is the center of everything, and a mind that cannot stop questioning is a mind that struggles to yield. Eli struggled. He entered his Rumspringa at 16 and took it further than anyone in our district expected. He got work in town, borrowed books from the public library, learned to drive from an English neighbor, and then one spring morning when I was 8 years old, he was simply gone. His chair at breakfast was empty. My mother's eyes were red and raw. Nobody spoke his name. His room was emptied within the week. The community gathered around my parents in that wordless Amish way, casseroles and quiet prayers, and the shared understanding that a wound like this was to be carried in silence. My father said nothing. He rose earlier, returned later, preached with the same steady voice every other Sunday, performed every duty of his office without visible change. If you had asked me at 8 or 9 or 12 whether my father missed Eli, I would have told you no, because he never showed it, not once, not to any of us, not in 9 years. And then came the night I found him. It was a Tuesday in late October, a night with a half moon and frost already on the grass, the whole house still carrying the sweetness of cinnamon and cloves from the apple butter my mother had made that afternoon. I was 14. I woke just past 3 in the morning, my wind-up clock faintly glowing on the shelf beside my bed, and I lay still in the dark trying to understand what had pulled me out of sleep. My sisters breathed softly in the beds beside mine. The house was quiet, and then I heard it, that slow and careful drag of the barn door. Someone was moving through the night and working very hard not to be heard doing it. My first thought was a sick horse. It happened sometimes with the older drafts, and my father was always the one who went, no matter the hour. But there was no urgency in the sound. No flickering lantern light through the window, just that single deliberate movement and then silence. I waited 10 minutes. I could not go back to sleep. Something was pulling at me the way a current pulls at a swimmer, patient and certain and stronger than it looks. I got up. I put on my shoes and my coat over my nightgown and crept downstairs, skipping the third step from the bottom because it creaked. The kitchen was cold and dark. I eased open the back door and stepped into the night. The frost-covered grass caught the moonlight and scattered it in every direction, silvers across the whole yard, and the barn sat massive and still against the dark ridgeline, its gambrel roof a black shape against the sky. The door was open just enough for a man to pass through. I crossed the yard, each footstep crunching in the cold, wincing at every sound. I reached the door frame and looked inside. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust. Moonlight fell through the high windows along the south wall in pale rectangles across the hay, and the broad backs of the horses standing quietly in their stalls. And in the far corner of the barn, sitting on an overturned milk bucket, with his head in his hands, was my father. He was crying, not with sobs, not loudly, not with any of the drama that grief is sometimes given. He was crying the way a man cries when he has been doing it for so long that the energy for sobs is gone, just a slow and steady leak of it, his shoulders moving in small, rhythmic tremors, his breath catching every few seconds, his hat off and lying on the ground beside him, his suspenders hanging loose. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him look, diminished, as though something essential had been removed from inside him. I had never seen my father cry. I had never seen any Amish man cry, not openly. Amish men are expected to bear their burdens quietly, to endure what God places on them without breaking, because breaking is a failure of faith. And my father was breaking. I must have made a sound because his head came up, and his eyes found me in the dark. And for a moment neither of us moved. His face was clear in the moonlight. His eyes were swollen. His beard was damp, and in his right hand, pressed against his thigh, was a letter. He said my name, just my name, nothing else. Keturah, and the way he said it was not anger, and it was not surprise. It was something closer to relief, the way a person sounds when they have been alone with something too heavy for too long, and they are glad, finally, that someone has come. He motioned me inside, and I went and sat down on a hay bale across from him, and the horses shifted softly in their stalls, and the smell of old wood and hay and animals wrapped around us like a second darkness, familiar and warm. And then my father told me the truth. Eli was alive. He was living in Milwaukee, 3 hours east, and he had a serious illness, the kind that does not simply resolve, the kind that requires ongoing treatment and does not disappear between visits. My father had known for 2 years. An English businessman who moved between our community and the city had brought the news, and from that moment, my father had been making secret trips to see his eldest son, once a month, riding with the same English driver from Viroqua, who the Amish in our area hired for distances too far for a buggy, telling my mother he was visiting a farmer about a bull calf, or meeting a fencing supplier, or attending a minister's gathering in another district. Small, believable lies that my mother never questioned because her husband was a deacon, and deacons travel, and deacons have responsibilities beyond the farm. As deacon, he was the enforcer of the community's separateness, the man who investigated violations, the man who reported back to the bishop. Though Eli had never been baptized and so was not formally under the Maidung, the strict shunning reserved for those who leave after baptism, the expectation was clear. Eli had rejected the faith. Contact with him, especially by the man whose office it was to guard the community's boundaries, would be seen as a betrayal of everything my father's role stood for. If the bishop learned, my father could be publicly reprimanded, required to confess before the entire congregation, stripped of his office. And my mother who had wept for Eli as if he had died and then walled off his name and his memory as an act of faith, if she learned that her husband had been visiting the son, she mourned in secret for 2 years. It would not be a simple hurt. It would be a collapse. My father looked at me in the moonlight and said, "I cannot stop going to see him. He is my son." He said it the same way he would say, "The hay needs cutting," or "The north fence needs mending," a fact that simply existed, beyond debate and beyond apology. And then he said the words that would shape the next decade of my life. He said, "You cannot tell your mother, Keturah, not ever. Can you carry this? Can you promise me that?" I was 14 years old. I said yes. I did not understand what I was agreeing to. I thought I was keeping a piece of information tucked away in a quiet corner, something I would rarely think about. I did not understand that a secret like that does not stay still. It moves through everything. It turns ordinary conversations into minefields, silences into codes, glances across the dinner table into messages requiring translation. Every time my mother spoke about obedience, I heard an accusation. Every time my father left the house before dawn, I wondered whether he was walking to the barn or climbing into that truck headed east. I started going with him when I was 16. One morning while I was doing the early milking, he came in and said, "Eli has been asking about you. He wants to know how you are." And something in his face told me that Eli was not the only one who needed this, that my father needed a witness, someone who knew and did not condemn, someone to sit beside him in the cab of that pickup and share the weight of what neither of them could say aloud at home. The first time I saw Eli, I almost did not know him. He was 27, thin in a way that spoke of sustained physical hardship, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, his hair cut short in the English style. He lived in a small apartment on the south side of Milwaukee, in a neighborhood of old brick and narrow streets that felt nothing like the green valleys of Vernon County. But when he smiled, I knew him instantly because it was my father's smile, that same slow spread, starting at the corners and reaching the eyes last. When he hugged me, I felt his ribs through his shirt, and I understood, completely and permanently, why my father cried in the barn at 3 a.m. Milwaukee was overwhelming to me in a way I had no framework for, all concrete and noise and density, nothing like Cashton or Viroqua. Eli noticed and took me to a park near Lake Michigan, and we sat watching water that stretched to the horizon like an ocean. And he told me about his life after leaving, the first year, which was the hardest, showing up in a city with no identification, no social security number, no bank account, no driver's license. Because Amish births are often recorded only in family Bibles and community directories, and not in government systems. He told me about the loneliness, which caught him off guard because he had left, because he felt suffocated by the rules and had not expected to grieve the structure. He told me about learning to use a computer, to navigate public transportation, to order food in a restaurant, all the small fluencies the world assumes everyone has. And he told me that the first time our father showed up at his apartment, still dressed in his Amish clothes with his hat and suspenders, and stood in the doorway looking at him, he had said only one word, the Pennsylvania Dutch word for calm and stillness and peace, the same word he used with frightened horses and frightened children, easy, and that Eli had wept immediately, because it was the first word his father had spoken to him in 9 years. I visited Eli 4 more times over the next 2 years. Each drive felt shorter. Each visit left me sitting quietly beside my father on the way home, the two of us watching the silos and the cornfields pass in the window, and the silence between us was not the silence of things unspoken, but the silence of two people who have understood each other completely. But the secret was hollowing me out. At home, I became someone I did not recognize, quieter, more withdrawn, prone to flashes of feeling I could not explain or contain. The double life made every meal at our family table feel like a performance. I sat across from my mother and listened to her speak about obedience and the righteousness of the Ordnung and the spiritual danger of following your own heart, and the man at the head of the table who she trusted with everything was, by her own standards, breaking every rule that mattered, and he was doing it because he loved his son. And love turned out to be stronger than the Ordnung when you put them in the same room together. The crisis came on a Sunday morning in the spring of my 17th year during worship at a neighbor's farmhouse. The service had just ended, and the congregation was moving outside for the communal meal when an English car stopped on the road at the edge of the property, and the driver from Viroqua got out and walked straight toward my father, who was standing near the barn with 2 other men from the church leadership. I watched it happen from across the yard. The driver leaned close and said something quiet and urgent. My father's face changed, the color leaving it all at once. He steadied himself. The driver looked around, realized he had walked into the middle of a Sunday gathering, and left. My father came to me immediately. He pulled me behind the barn and his hands were shaking, and he said, "Eli is in the hospital," he said. "I have to go," he said. "Your mother cannot know." I saw something in his face I had never seen before. Not the grief I had watched from the doorway that October night, but fear, the kind that lives below the ordinary surface of a person and only surfaces when the thing they most dread is close. He was afraid of losing Eli in the permanent way, the way that cannot be undone, and afraid of losing him in a world the community did not even know he still inhabited. He was gone within the hour, the same lie given to my mother, the same truck disappearing down the road. I stood in the yard and felt every secret I was carrying settle onto my shoulders in a single moment, heavier than it had ever felt before. He came back that night. Eli was stable, but something in my father had shifted and did not shift back. He moved more slowly after that. He spent longer in the barn. He developed a habit of standing at the kitchen window after supper, staring toward the road as if expecting something he could not prepare for. My mother filled the silence the way she always had, with cooking and quilting and prayer, devoted and steady and entirely unaware of what was happening inside the man beside her. The next 3 years were the hardest of my life. I turned 18. My Rumspringa began, though in our conservative district it was more of a formality than a genuine period of exploration, and the expectation was that I would be baptized and marry and take my place in the community.
Part of me wanted that.
Genuinely, I loved the farm. I loved the rhythm of the seasons and the warmth of a wood stove on a January morning, and the sound of hooves on the gravel lane, and the way the entire community showed up without being asked when a family was in need. Those things were real and beautiful, and I miss them still. But I could not separate the beauty from what it cost. I could not look at the Ordnung without seeing Eli's empty chair. I could not hear the word Gelassenheit without seeing my father's face in the moonlight, his beard wet, a letter crumpled in his fist. The faith that was supposed to give me peace become the site of my deepest conflict. I left at 19, not suddenly like Eli. I sat down at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening and told my parents I was not going to be baptized and that I was going to Madison. My mother wept. My father sat very still looking at his hands. He did not argue. When my mother left the room, he looked up at me, and his expression was not anger or disappointment. It was recognition. A man looking at someone who had arrived at the same place he had arrived at years ago, and by the same road. He walked to the kitchen door and stopped with his back to me and said, "Take care of yourself, Keturah." And then, quieter, almost too quiet to hear, "Thank you for keeping the promise." I moved to Madison and got my GED and found work at a dairy processing facility, which felt like both an escape from my former life and a kind of homecoming to it. The smell of milk and the rhythm of production, carrying something familiar inside the new. I built a life slowly, the way anyone builds one when they arrive somewhere without a map. Eli and I grew closer. He was still in Milwaukee, still managing his health, and now I could visit whenever I chose, in my own car, without a cover story. We would sit in his apartment eating takeout, and he would ask if I was happy, and I would say I was getting there, and he would nod because he understood that getting there was the honest answer, and that anyone who claimed to be fully there had either never left anything behind or was not being truthful about the leaving. I am in my early 30s now. Eli is in his early 40s. His health stabilized over the past several years, and he works part-time at a hardware store where his ability to take apart and reassemble anything with his hands is the most useful thing about him. My father is in his mid-60s. He is still on the farm, still a deacon, still walking to the barn before sunrise every morning. My mother is still beside him, still humming while she cooks, her faith as steady as it has ever been. She does not know, she has never known. Our conversations when I call are brief and careful. Two people navigating a room full of furniture in the dark, neither of us quite willing to say where the edges are. She does not visit Madison. She does not ask about my life. When I visit the farm 2 or 3 times a year, my father always finds a reason to walk out to the barn, and I always follow him, and we stand together in the same corner where I found him broken open all those years ago. The horses breathing softly in their stalls, the smell of hay and old wood around us, and we do not need to speak. The silence between us is not the silence of secrets anymore. It is the silence of two people who understand each other completely, who know that love does not always fit inside the rules, and that sometimes the most honest thing a person can do is the thing that cannot be spoken in the places where they are most known. I want to be clear that I am not telling this story to judge the community I came from. The Amish gave me my work ethic, my relationship to the land, my understanding of what it means to belong to something larger than yourself. The mutual aid and the communal support and the willingness to drop everything for a neighbor in need are things the rest of the world has largely lost and would be better for recovering. The Amish population in the United States has more than doubled since 2000 and continues to grow because their way of life provides meaning and belonging and structure in a world that offers too little of all three. And that is not an accident. But inside any system built on yielding the individual to the whole, there are people carrying impossible contradictions, people who love their faith and love the ones who have left it, and who discover, in the worst possible way, that those two loves can pull in directions that cannot both be followed at once. My father believed in Gelassenheit, the surrender of self to God and community with everything he had, and he violated it every single time he climbed into that truck and drove east to sit beside his sick son in a Milwaukee apartment. He was not a hypocrite, he was a father. The rules were never designed to tell the difference. I still think about that night, the frost on the grass, the moonlight on the hay, my father with his hat on the ground and his suspenders loose and his face wet, holding a letter from the son who was supposed to be as good as dead to him. I think about the way he said my name, Keturah, not as a command or a correction, but as an invitation. Come in, sit down, let me show you who I actually am beneath all of this. That is what secrets do in the end. When they have been carried long enough, they stop hiding things, they start revealing them. My father's secret revealed that beneath the severity and the silence and the unwavering performance of faith, there was a man whose love for his child was simply larger than his fear of what that love would cost him. And my willingness to carry it with him revealed something about me that I did not fully understand until years later, that I had already begun to leave, not in body, not yet, but in the place where decisions are made before they are spoken. I had already chosen the complicated, rule-breaking love of a father in a barn at 3 a.m. over the clean and orderly love of a community that did not know he was there. I do not regret that choice, but I carry it every day. The way my father carried that letter, the way Eli carries his scars, the way my mother carries a faith whose full story she has never been told. We are all carrying something. The only question is whether we have to carry it alone.